What's up, folks? It's Dr. Akins here with another episode for you. The Art of Advocacy. That's right. The Art of Advocacy brought to you by Leading Equity, becoming an advocate for all students in stores now. Feel free to pick it up. If you haven't subscribed to the show already, make sure that you subscribe to the show. Hit the hit the bell so you can get notified every time we go live, which we go live on Thursdays, every Thursday, 6:30 p.m. Eastern. Well, today's special guest I'm going to bring on in just a moment. We're going to be talking about mental health training in our schools, and we're going to have a really good conversation. My special guest today is Mr. Justin Thomas, a licensed professional counselor in Oregon who has spent his 14-year career serving people through community health, mental health, and alcohol and drug programs. In Oregon, he started his own training business, Fundamental Consulting. So, without further ado, Justin, how you doing today?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Oh, man, the pleasure is all mine. I'm happy to have you here. Now, we met in Oregon. Oh, was it early this summer, August, sometime around then?
Yeah, September maybe.
September. Okay.
You came out twice, actually.
Yeah. So we met. I was working in your county, doing some training with your group, and we connected, and we're like, yeah, let's keep in touch. And so I'm glad you're able to join us today for this session. So I know a little bit about you, but I'd love for you to share with our audience out there a little bit about yourself and what you currently do.
Yeah, sure. So I grew up here in Oregon and am working currently in the community that I was raised in, and have a big sense of pride in that and be able to give back to the community that has given me a lot. And for my entire professional career, I have worked at Lynn County, which is the county you came out and helped us out with, and have spent most of my time working in mental health services, providing crisis counseling to individuals in our community. And a good chunk of that time was supervising our crisis department, which meant a lot of interface with community hospitals and law enforcement and school districts, fire departments, and just about anybody who wanted to be a part of making mental health better in our community. And then about a year ago, I transitioned out of that role and am managing an alcohol and drug department, which I started my career in. So it's kind of neat to be kind of brought back full circle and still working for the same place that I've worked all along. And now in my side time, I have started my own training business, Fundamental Consulting. And really a big part of my passion is teaching other people the information that I've been able to gain through my experience and education about mental health, and just raising that awareness and fighting through that stigma.
Thank you for that. So Fundamental Consulting, you have to tell us a little bit more as far as what does that mean? Like, who do you work with in that capacity?
So I currently am working with law enforcement and am starting up more outreach efforts to schools and hospitals. But I really want it to be a platform where people can get any kind of mental health training that fits their needs. Part of my strategy over the course of my career has been to really listen to what community partners are needing in terms of their training, and then trying to adapt what I do to give them that. And I know that our community members who are not affiliated with any agencies need a lot of that information as well. And so part of the reason I titled it Fundamental was to be able to offer some foundational skills, basics on mental health trainings that are broad enough to reach anybody, but then to have some specialty trainings and courses that would be more on a professional level.
Okay. I got you there. That makes a lot of sense. Well, okay. You talked about mental health training in various capacities. I want to kind of start off by asking you, when it comes to mental health training, what are some key, priorities or qualities that you want to see in those mental health training programs or organizations?
Yeah, well, in in specific to schools too, like I think there's a lot of great trainings out there. But part of what I think makes a training really effective is being able to prioritize what that person or what that agency needs and then delivering that to them, right? In a way that is not necessarily a canned kind of training, one that fits the need of that program and agency. And so that's part of what I try to do and have tried to adapt my trainings over the years to offer that. Another thing that I've always appreciated when I've taken trainings about mental health is just the realism from a trainer. It's one thing to get up in front of a group of people and lecture for an hour or two, but to actually have a discussion and kind of get off script a little bit and answer the questions that the people want to hear, I think is super important. And just being genuine in those responses is part of what I think makes a really good training.
Okay. Okay. So I think I get the whole, okay, you got to be equitable. It needs to make sure that whoever you're addressing is, addressing those individual needs are being met. But what is maybe where would you start, I guess, with the training? Is it maybe some background key terms type of things, or maybe what is, I guess, the initial phase that you would take?
Yeah. So in most trainings, we try to think about what the audience already knows, right? And so this is where I think when we think about school systems in particular, a lot of individuals in the school structure in terms of the staff have a lot of this information already from different trainings, especially if they're counseling staff within the school. They may know some of this stuff. But on a foundational or fundamental level, we want people to know the basics, which is recognition of when people are struggling emotionally and what some of the symptoms are in the different categories of mental illness that we have. We have this enormous book called the DSM. It's the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, and that has all of the mental health disorders and criteria to meet those disorders. And it's a lot of information. And so I try to break that down in a simple way so that people at least have an understanding of some of the categories and the different disorders within them and the symptoms that they can be looking out for either in themselves or in other people to offer that initial support.
Okay. All right. Well, I like that. You mentioned recognizing when people are struggling, and I want to know for myself too.
Yeah.
What are some of those signs that we can utilize to recognize when people are struggling?
Energy and sleep are huge. It's one of the things that I think we take for granted. I know that a lot of people struggle with sleep just based on our habits of taking in information, whether it be social media or watching Netflix. Most people will do those things right up until the point of going to bed. And that can impact our sleep. It impacts the way our brain functions and how it shuts down at night to try to rest. And so I'm usually asking people about how you're sleeping, how's your energy level, and if they're struggling in some way in that's usually my go-to responses and trying to get them to shift that a little so that they're getting better rest, because our bodies are really well equipped to repair itself and allow it to feel better. But we hinder it when we don't allow ourselves to get good rest. So energy is a big one, and sleep.
Energy and sleep, and sometimes the sleep one is looked down upon. I knew someone that used to look down on someone that takes naps. Like, oh, that's why would you? That's not being productive. Like, how do you counter those type of comments that come your way, Justin?
Well, that's interesting because I think some people would say the opposite. Like, man, I wish I could nap more, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's the fun part about doing the kind of work that I do with mental health is that it's also subjective. What's good for one person isn't necessarily going to be good for another, and so I try to fight some of that stigma a little bit by just telling people, like, here's your options. If you're struggling in this particular area, whether it be your mood's low because you're struggling with some mild depression, or it's a sleep issue or anxiety, like, these are all the things you can do to try and cope. And you should try several of them because you don't know which one's going to be the one that you like or the one that actually works for you. Because certainly we wouldn't want people doing something that they felt embarrassed about or ashamed about. We want people to actually use these skills and most importantly, to practice them when they don't actually need them. Meaning, you have to practice to get good at it, right? And so when you're stressed out or struggling to get through your day, that's not the time to start a new skill necessarily. You want to get good at it before you need it.
Okay, yeah, you don't want to wait to the last minute. I mean, I hear that a lot, the conversation about not waiting till it's too late. This is something that maintaining your mental health is something that you do on a daily basis. It's not something that you do when you're in crisis. So I heard that a lot. And is that kind of going back to what like crisis management really means, as far as like, is that more of the strategy of trying to keep it from happening, or is it to maintain it? Like, what is that coming from, I guess?
Yes, and all of the above.
Okay.
It's everything you said. Because unfortunately, we have, even though we're doing better in our country and globally about reducing stigma around mental health, we have a long ways to go still. And unfortunately, we're not to a point yet where people talk openly about how they're feeling and actually actively take steps to feel better for themselves. And part of that is just not having an awareness of what the struggles they're having are. People don't have a great understanding typically of what it means to struggle with mental illness or to have symptoms of a mental health disorder. And so I try to give people that understanding so that they can see it in themselves or in other people, and then start working on bettering themselves or giving more support to the person that's struggling, so that it becomes more of a preventative measure. But a lot of the crises that we see in our communities are typically because of just that they haven't been doing anything active. They don't have maybe the language to actually describe how it is they're feeling to other people. And so all those things get kind of tossed to the side until they become too big for that person to keep down anymore, and a crisis happens.
Okay. When you work with schools, for example, and you're dealing with supporting them in the mental health, do you have those conversations or about school discipline and the relation of maybe how a child might be responding or behaving might be maybe connected to mental health?
Yeah, that's certainly something we talk about, because I've been part of threat assessment teams, for example, or most often it would be kids that are having some sort of suicidal ideation because of whatever's going on circumstantially in their life. And
Mm-hmm.
so we would have to talk with school staff and administrators about just the reality of what this kid has the capacity to withstand, and to recognize that unless we do something more to teach this individual and their family how to cope with this situation, we shouldn't expect that it's just going to get better. Sometimes kids have behaviors at school that lead to suspensions,
Yeah.
and while there is certainly a place for that, if they're not also getting help, then that behavior is likely to continue. And so those are the conversations that we try to have, and try to really encourage families to see the benefit in getting counseling support, because that's a battle too sometimes, where we just don't talk about these things enough that people can accept that help is needed and beneficial.
Yeah. Are you seeing more schools looking at trying to put in mental health services? Is that starting to pick up more across, maybe in your area and even nationwide?
Yeah, well, and there's some great programs out there too, like Sources of Strength, which are school based, where it's almost like a variation of a leadership group that's focused more on emotional wellness. And at least my understanding of Sources of Strength is that they will pick kids from different sort of groups within the school to have a good representation, and they'll help educate them so that they can go educate some of their peers and be supported through their peer group. And I really like that approach. I just also think that we could be doing a lot more for the entire student body and all of the staff as well. Having school counselors in schools is great. I know that having mental health counselors as well is super helpful. A lot of school districts, at least in Oregon, partner with local community mental health programs like county agencies, and they will go into the schools certain number of hours per week and try to offer that counseling support.
Okay. Yeah. And I think that that's helpful. It's just, I wonder, funding wise and just
Yeah.
things like that, if those can be, have you seen those as challenges?
Yeah, well, and another hard part is we really want to get families involved when we're treating youth. And when we do it at the school, it's sometimes harder to do that because parents are
Mhm,
working. And a lot of clinics close at 5. And so to
mhm.
try to get families involved is a difficult thing sometimes. I know locally, at least, we do have funding where we can help kids as sort of early intervention strategies to try and get them support before they actually have a full blown mental health disorder. And that's a great strategy, but that's usually funded by grants because the other downfall to mental health counseling in the field that we're in is that to have something be a billable service, you actually have to have a diagnosis, which means you have a disorder already. And we would love to do more preventative care, but those things typically aren't as well funded.
So do you have psychologists working with you then to do diagnosis, or are they backed up? I'm curious.
So, so psychologists are sort of a different tier. They can do assessments to diagnose, but mental health professionals like myself, who have a master's degree, can also do
Oh,
diagnosing.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't know that. Okay, all right. So then I guess it just sounds like it's one of those situations where you need to be able to pay to get a child assessed, but if the child is not already assessed, then there's can be issues with the pricing.
Well, it's
Uh,
that. So part of what it is that we have pretty decent access, at least locally here,
Okay.
to get kids assessed for mental health.
Okay.
But if they're struggling, but not to a point of being given a diagnosis, we really aren't able to offer them treatment because we
Right.
can only treat something that is a disorder. And
Mhm.
so for a lot of the kids that do struggle and families that struggle, we could teach them a lot of skills way before, way
Okay.
upstream before they have a mental health condition at that point.
Okay. Well, that's good. Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
But those are the things that aren't really funded very well, is all that
Mhm.
upstream stuff. And unfortunately, it's not quite like the medical system yet. We've got some laws across the nation that are trying to make better parity acts between primary care and health versus mental health
Mhm.
and behavioral health, but we're just not quite there yet.
Okay. And then you mentioned that sometimes the hours that schools are, or at least the parents are at work, and so just being able to connect with the parents for students for their child can be tough.
Yeah.
Are, are they able to do after hours or before hours? Any of those kind of things? Is that an option that's available?
Yeah. Usually clinics will try and stay open till 5 or 6, 5:30, 6 o'clock to allow for some of that wiggle room for clients and their families to come in.
Okay.
I know locally some of our clinics are open as late as 8 o'clock, but it's a hard thing again with stigma and going back to like energy and fatigue of people. It's hard to work a
Mhm.
full day and then go have a counseling session with your family late at night. So that buy-in piece we still struggle with sometimes. There's certainly plenty of families that are readily available and wanting our help. But we do run into that resistance because of the stigma that's still out there.
Okay. Okay. What are some other things maybe that schools can do? Let's say if even if they haven't brought in mental health training, what are some things that schools can do to support their community?
Yeah, well, I mean, first thing I would encourage schools to do is really take a pulse of what's going on in their community. What kind of resources are available? What are your community partnerships like? I know for me personally, working in the community I'm in, uh, we had a lot of miscommunication over the years, and it wasn't until we really started talking to one another about what are the issues at hand in our community, how do we address them together, and trying to understand what each other's responsibility and obligations and ability to provide a service in the community is. That's when we start actually working together on these issues. So trying to get a pulse on who your community partners are is a great first step, and then really trying to evaluate what are your needs within your school, because I know even though school districts often will plan for things across the whole district. Each school is very, very different. And so I think having some sort of way to consider the needs of your students, consider the needs of your staff, and work with some of your local partners, whether it be a community health program or private consultant, to try and really structure and customize a training to those needs, I think would be great.
Okay. Communities and the partners, finding out what the needs are. And then I guess once you find those needs, is there maybe some kind of ways that they can send out education? Like, do you suggest maybe bringing in workshops or open houses or any of those kind of things for those kind of parent nights or anything like that?
Well, this is where it gets complicated, I think, because schools, at least the ones I've worked with, in terms of
Mhm.
training their staff, they usually have those trainings booked out like a year in advance,
Okay.
and they're often only allowed or afforded so many training hours, and they have other issues to address as well, and so they have priorities that they need to look at. Um, Part of what the conversation I've had with administrators is that it's hard to deprioritize mental health. And so just to
Mhm.
keep that in mind, that when we have a crisis at a school, it is a huge, huge impact. I mean, especially if we're talking about a death of a student from suicide,
Mhm.
that is something that ripples through a community like nothing else. And so we want to be prepared for those things, and even more importantly, we want to prevent those things. And doing training effectively across all of the staff members and educating students in a way that gives them the voice so that they can advocate for themselves is incredibly important.
Got you. Okay. Well, I'm just thinking, those things make sense. And I know there's always, more if there's always more information or funding, a lot of things kind of just depends on this on the situation when it comes to educating our community and how our schools can get involved. I think I want to kind of shift over to the crisis plan because I know you have training on that. Love for you to kind of share with us, what does a crisis plan look like?
Well, ideally, a crisis plan is going to look different for every individual, but
Mhm.
from a systems perspective, it should look very similar across the board. I think starting i- ideally, my crisis plan would actually include preventative measures too, which is all that training component piece and
Mhm.
evaluating your needs, because the best interventions for crisis include preventative measures, because crises come and go, and we want to be ready for whatever the situation is going to throw at us, right? But specifically, uh, schools should be thinking about student safety first and foremost. If something happens, especially at school, where a student is actively hurting themselves or attempting to hurt themselves, that is a pretty big deal for anyone who witnesses it and the individual themselves. And so, keeping in mind that a plan really should look at student safety and staff safety in terms of their trauma from witnessing that, and not to downplay that in any way. I think sometimes schools think that they've isolated an incident because they've helped the individual in need, but there might have been 10 or 15 people who observed what happened or heard about what happened, and now they're impacted because of their own history or their own experience of that traumatic event. So a plan should include those things. And then a tiered approach to intervention and assessing risk in those moments of crisis. And I say tiered approach because at least most schools in Oregon, because we've had some statute that's required some of these things, they will have gatekeepers, which are people who've had a certain amount of training in how to ask the right questions about suicide risk, for example. And if the student checks off enough of those boxes that says they're a moderate to higher risk, then
Mhm.
it kind of gets shuffled off to another person who has more training and more expertise. And typically that next person is going to be a counselor of some sort. And so schools should have an idea of what that tier looks like and what staff can and should intervene at certain points. Ideally, any staff member, in my opinion, should be able to ask another student if they're having any thoughts of suicide and know what to do with that information, right? Because part of what we want is to create an environment where kids can openly discuss their feelings, and not every student is connected to teachers. That might include bus drivers or cafeteria staff. And so we want to try to train that amount of information on a fundamental level to everybody. But then beyond that, if that kid is having, intense suicidal thinking, has a plan, has means, is showing some intent, those do need to get kicked off to people with more professional expertise, because those are going to be more intense situations to handle. Another step would be we need to engage families. I think sometimes we get into circumstances where schools will call mental health in, and especially if the kid is 14 or older, in Oregon, age of consent is 14. And so if we can come in and resolve an issue, then the school might be okay with that. But we're wanting to make sure that the family knows what's going on and that they're going to also be a support for this kid. And sometimes families are part of the problem, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't include them. And so we need to address those things as a family system, and not isolate that. That's been part of the problem in Oregon, and I'm sure other states across the country, is that we sometimes focus too much on the individual and not the family dynamics that they're in. And so we try and fix, fix is, I put fix in quotes because that's not the right word to use, but that's the word people use sometimes. We try to help this individual get better, but if the family system doesn't change, then it's harder for them to change. And sending them off to residential treatment or an inpatient hospitalization typically doesn't work if there's problems still in the family. So addressing family, and the school should know how to incorporate them into the fold.
So essentially, when you're doing the if we're talking with working with one student, not only does the student need to be agreeable to want get better, but also the family support structure needs to change as well. So what kind of services can be done while with the family side, while the student is going through their side of things?
Yeah, so there's family treatment components that we can do where we're actually working with the family or even siblings and trying to get them to recognize how they can be supportive of an individual. Part of that actually includes just the idea that they might struggle at some point in the future, and trying to check in with them about their own mental health, because certainly there's a higher risk of having a mental health condition genetically, or just on a learned behavior sense, if you have close relatives with family or within your family that have a mental health condition too. So we're wanting to make sure that everyone's getting the help that they need and trying to work together on all these things.
Okay. So that makes sense, because I mean, you're right. If you send someone off and then they got to come right back to the home situation that was there before, what's going to change?
Well, and what's really frustrating is when schools, and not to pick on schools, but because other places do this, primary care will do this at times. Mental health offices will sometimes even do this. They will have a person in crisis and they will say, "This is so intense, we need to send this person to the emergency department and be done with it," sort of like distance ourselves from it. And that is a mindset that breaks systems, in my opinion, systems of care, because now you're bottlenecking the emergency department, the ED, and that's a big problem, because the EDs are important and vital role in our community, and we need to keep them flowing through with patients. And when you have people with mental health conditions that are struggling in a way that could be offered support through outpatient services or on-site services at the school, but sending them to the ED just doesn't work all the time. There are definitely places and situations where that does need to occur. Ideally, mental health would be helping make that decision, though. So part of the next step I have is making sure that the schools know how to connect to a professional in that capacity. So when they've evaluated through their tiered approach of assessing on site, And now it reaches a level of, we need a mental health professional here. Know who you need to call. Every state's going to have different regulations on this, I would imagine. But in Oregon, our community mental health programs have some obligation to provide that crisis service to the community and in the community, meaning they're leaving the office, going to wherever the crisis occurs, and doing their job there. So that's a service that schools need to be aware of. And then recognizing also that not all situations are going to result in a crisis. They might tame down. And so having good resources to connect that individual and their families to is incredibly important. A lot of mental health crises that I've seen in my time aren't really mental health related even. They're circumstantial because of other things like, food insecurity or domestic violence or, also all sorts of things. So having a wealth of resources to refer families to is going to better support that family and decrease their risk for crisis over time. And then the last little bullet point I was going to share is just that making sure that when crises occur, debriefing incidents with staff and students that we're observing or involved in some way is really crucial. You're going to find out a lot about your staff and your students and their wellness when you check in with them after an event. And sometimes it might need to occur a couple times or a few times, within the next week or two, because people are not always ready to talk about how they're feeling, or they've been in shock from an incident and need a few days to be able to talk. So having some plan to debrief incidents is important.
Okay. Well, Justin, I've learned a lot just from talking to you over this time about mental health training and what it should look like. So I definitely appreciate that. I wanted to check with you to see if there's something else that you wanted to add to the conversation, or if you wanted to leave us with your final thoughts.
Yeah, just that I really hope that everyone who's listening or watches this later recognizes the importance that mental health training is something that everyone needs. This is not something that is a niche market for law enforcement or mental health providers or educators. We all need this information. And unfortunately, our systems are not set up in a way where we get much of this early on. And so find ways to educate yourself, take trainings, reach out to people that are professionals, and try and be a part of this community of making people better.
Well, Justin, if we have some folks that want to connect with you, what's the best way to reach you online?
Yeah, the best way to reach me will be on my website, fundamentalconsulting.org. You can find all of my information about different kinds of trainings that I might offer and all of my social media contacts.
All right. Well, Justin, it has truly been a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Well, folks, that concludes another episode of The Art of Advocacy. My special guest was Justin Thomas. It was truly an honor to have him on. I think one of my key takeaways from today was the importance of learning how to recognize when folks are struggling. I think that one was one of the biggest ones that stood out to me from today's conversation, is because that's so important. We often deal with our own daily lives. We often deal with what we have going on in life. And sometimes we don't always, because we're struggling with our own stuff, sometimes we forget to check on our friends, our neighbors, our colleagues, our peers. And I think that piece right there was very important. So as we wrap up, remember, we'll be here next week. And if you celebrate Christmas, I want to say happy holidays to you. Merry Christmas to you. If you celebrate something else during this time of year, happy holidays to you as well. Remember the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. If you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. But by all means, keep moving. Let's continue to be a voice leading equity.